ended up working on foreclosure and evictions was that we went out and a whole bunch of working class folks from neighborhoods in Portland went out and went into working class neighborhoods and actually knocked on about 30,000 doors over the course of the summer, asking people how the economy was affecting them, what was feeling hardest in their lives, and would they come together and do something about it. And then we started calling people back and saying, well, we're going to do something about it. Were you serious? Let's come together. And we started talking with folks about a number of things, but foreclosure was one of the things that working class families kept saying, this is a crisis for us right now, and we'll do something about it. And as we started to meet with those folks, they had all of the things that you would expect folks who were really dedicated to being homeowners would have as baggage. They really wanted lawyers. If only there were enough lawyers to be a solution. And we spent a whole meeting talking about how there are no lawyers, and in fact the law doesn't work very well, and our solution isn't the lawyers. And yay! That's not how a lot of folks felt at the time, but and instead talking about what it meant to have solidarity and what it meant to use working class neighborhood direct action was what we wanted to start to build. So we started to talk with folks about the solution we think is actually neighborhood direct action for a couple of reasons. That your home is in a neighborhood and the bank isn't in the neighborhood. So we actually have an advantage when we organize solidarity in our neighborhood versus trying to go to the bank and fight with the bank on their territory. But also kind of a really basic thing is that we outnumber them. I mean, like if you count in our neighborhood, the bankers don't live here. So we outnumber them, and if we organize amongst the people that outnumber them, we can actually fight back way more effectively than if we take them on one at a time through these really processy routes. So that's what we started to do, is have conversations about that. And then something really, really awesome happened, and Occupy exploded all over the country. And it just like exploded that conversation in ways that would have been almost impossible to visualize sitting down and talking with these folks in the same way that we were able to have conversations, because Occupy really exploded the conversation about what it meant to take action, and also about what it meant to have a criticism of the way the economy worked. And so that really infused a tremendous amount of energy and excitement into the work that we were doing, but also a lot of folks who got really interested and involved in Occupy started to also get really involved in joining the committees of homeowners that were fighting. In the course of the last couple of years, part of what we've been doing is moving people back into homes that they were forced out of by banks, creating neighborhood networks of resistance. Right now we've been working with about 12 homes that are in some phase of fighting against foreclosure and eviction, and have gone public about their willingness to fight and their refusal to leave their house, whether they're ordered by eviction or not. We've built a network of thousands of supporters throughout the city who may or may not all share our politics, but who have decided they know which side they're on in the fight. And have built a network of about 800 people who see themselves as rapid responders, folks who get a text message if there's an eviction or an action in defense of a house and come out and help defend it. And not all 800 show up at once, whoever's available. And then out of that rapid response network, there's also growing committees of organizing happening in different neighborhoods to deepen the networking and strengthen and have the network be more and more people coming out and not even having to drive across town to respond, but being able to walk down the block. And then another piece of what we really put a lot of work into was working with some of the homeowners that at first actually really saw themselves as property owners, right? And they were part of the property ownership, and that was a proud thing. And they've been told for decades and decades that this was the way to make it, was to own property. To start having conversations with those folks about, well, what's the difference between that and saying housing is a human right? Which way do we feel about this? And actually had a whole meeting where people actually fought it out a little bit, not physically, but had a lot of arguments. And there are some people who left because the group said, no, we're about housing as a human right. And there are a few people like, no, I'm about property, I'm out of here, right? But as a group, as a working class group of folks, they said, okay, no, this is actually where we stand. And then later, as we started to build affinity with houseless organizing and tenant organizing, they had another discussion. So when we moved back in last May, on May Day, Alicia Jackson, but also a couple who they've been evicted twice and we've moved them back in twice. But the companies have cut off their water as a tool to try to get them out, right? So organizing things like alternate ways for people to have water, whether it's porta potties or rain barrels or water delivery. For a while it was just folks bringing jugs of water and dropping them off in order to keep that supply going and having that sort of just basic level of support. But it's also things like helping to organize events around the houses. We did, over the summer, a lot of block parties and stuff where it really invited broader participation, but also brought people to the house, made people feel a little more comfortable about being around and getting to know who the family is and who's going to be coming to help them out. But it also was an opportunity for families and folks to be able to come out and say, I'm not only in this fight for myself, but I'm going to the event that's at this other house, and to demonstrate support and solidarity across homes, so that it's clear that it's not just one person taking on a fight over here that's really isolated and over there really isolated, which I have to say took the press like a year and a half to figure out these things were connected to each other. They're like, oh, there's like someone resisting over here, and oh, there's someone resisting over there, and someone, wait a minute, she went to her house, and it really took them about a year to put all that together. So don't count on the press to actually know what the hell you're doing, because even when you tell them, they won't know. And then one of the key pieces for the work that we've been doing is also to have sort of an infrastructure of 2 or 3 folks who are taking on really maintaining key relationships with the homes that are in crisis. And part of those key relationships are really helping people develop what is your plan, what's your eviction defense plan, how do you want to communicate that to everyone else, how do you want to work on putting together what your story is and how you're going to be your own spokesperson and be able to convey that to the public. And being sort of an ongoing, steady base of support, it's super scary for folks who are going through all of this chaos around their housing situation and for the first time often taking action steps that they have never taken before. A lot of these folks have never gone to a protest before, had never, they, for the first time, took over a street with a large crowd. It was the first time that they've broken a lot of laws, and they're breaking them a lot fast. So having some core folks who are kind of a piece of giving them real support and helping communicate what they're wanting to do and how they want to struggle in the fight. So that's a lot of different folks involved at all kinds of different levels. But the folks who are in the homes themselves that are resisting, that are saying, I'm going to fight back, I'm not going to be evicted, there's also a big task for them. It's not about folks coming and like fighting for them. It's about, all of this support is about fighting alongside. And so folks that are a part of being able to connect with the Rapid Response Network, being able to draw on all the support across the neighborhood, have to also make commitments to that community of support and say, I'm committed to building a movement. I'm committed to supporting others. I'm committed to solidarity, not just to my own fight. I'm willing to be trained, or at least one person in the family. Everyone doesn't have to feel comfortable talking in public or telling the story, but at least one person has to be willing to be a spokesperson so that people actually are taking agency over telling their own story rather than having people tell it for them. putting together a plan for their own defense of their home, for their own eviction, for their own move-in, and helping to organize their own team of support around that. And sometimes that means they mostly draw on family or friends, sometimes it's neighbors, different community folks. And if someone doesn't have all that network, like they don't have a big personal network, that's okay. We help figure out how to put something together with them, but they have to be a part of it. It doesn't get done magic. No wands get waved and magic happens. But it's really also about them having real agency about what's about to happen. Like if they're saying, we have one family that's, they're pacifists. And while everyone that comes to their house may not agree with pacifism and could argue that with them, it's a really important thing that the visual of their action is a certain way. Because they're going to have to stand out in front and say, I'm fighting and this is how. And so them actually thinking about that and communicating to other folks, this is the type of action we want to create around it, and having real agency in that. Folks have to commit to organizing in their neighborhood. Sometimes people don't get along with their neighbors. Sometimes they've had disputes in the past. Those can come and bite you in the ass if you're about to duke it out with the police on your front lawn. So we kind of try to heal that stuff prior, but also that it's so much more powerful if your neighbor comes to you and says, will you come support me, than to have somebody else go do it, right? That's a powerful thing to go to your neighbors and say, will you support me, and to see that support start to come and pop up throughout the neighborhood. There's one of the folks that we've worked with for a couple of years, Debbie. She was the first person in Portland to go public that she refused to stay. She refused to let the sheriff move her out. And she was convinced that her neighbors would support her. But when she and her kids and her husband went door to door with us and started talking to folks, about a week later, if you look down her street, for several blocks, every single yard had a sign in it that said, we support our neighbor. And you look down the whole street, and every single yard had support for her. And it really changed how much she felt she could last, how long she felt like she could duke it out. And she stayed, unfortunately, she was evicted in January. And the fight's not over. They found some housing for right now, and we're still planning what the next step is. Fannie Mae evicted her, and they brought 25 police and sheriff's deputies to her house at 5 a.m. in the dark, and threw her out on the street and changed the locks within 10 minutes. And then Fannie Mae paid for an armed guard to be in the house 24 hours a day to prevent, they kind of learned what we do, and they're like, don't you dare move back in. We know that's what you do after you get kicked out, because we had moved other families back in after eviction. So they are currently still paying, since January 16th, an armed guard to be in the house 24 hours a day, which we estimate to be $500 to $800 they're spending every day to keep the house empty of a family. Which our suggestion was, we know someone who would really be great to maintain this house and wouldn't charge you anything. Her name's Debbie. She has a squirrel as a pet who is still in the house. And her husband Ron's awesome. They would totally look after this house for you, and they wouldn't charge you $500. Fannie Mae has not accepted that offer, however. But we're still trying. So all of those pieces are what also the folks who are fighting to stay in their homes are taking on as part of the fight, which is a lot of different pieces for them to take on. But what's been really cool is seeing folks who are learning all of these skills of like fighting and hitting back, and are starting to think about the actions of their house, and starting to think about other people's actions, and who, like, they call each other up on their phone and they're like, how's it going over there? Is the sheriff coming for you yet? If they are, I'm going to be there. And seeing that network start to develop and grow. But also seeing the level of support in neighborhoods was actually surprising. We expected that there would be a lot more folks who would get really uncomfortable in neighborhoods, especially when police started coming in big numbers. One of the evictions of an African-American family in Southeast Portland, they sent 65 police and sheriffs, and they actually matched us nearly person for person. Literally, they had 65 armed people, we had 65 unarmed people. They were scared, apparently. You know, because terrifying to have all those people who just like homes a whole lot. That family got evicted for the second time by the 65 police, and we spent a week sort of regrouping because it was really traumatic. Patricia's mom actually passed out from the stress of so many police being at their front yard. And Patricia herself is on oxygen, which they withheld her oxygen machine for several hours. We had to negotiate to get it back. And then she and Darren were like, well, what do we got to lose? Let's move back in. So we retook the house about a week and a half later. And just like the police had kind of learned a lot about our rapid response, which is why they had matched us, they had figured out exactly how long it took us to get to that number, and they were escalating their numbers alongside of us at the same pace. So every time, when 10 of us rolled in, 10 cops rolled in, and they kept escalating alongside of us. We were like, oh shit, clearly they've got the beat on our stuff. Let's try something new. So when we retook their house, we had a small group of folks. We had a retired minister, a longshoreman, like just try and mimic these folks again. And instead of having rapid response try to go to the house in support, rapid responders actually went down to City Hall and took over a city council meeting and demanded that the city back off from re-evicting. And as the police rolled up to Patricia and Darren's house and were trying to break down the door to re-evict them, the call came from City Hall to back off and go away. That they decided, in fact, they didn't really want jurisdiction over this one, make it the sheriff's problem. And the city has sort of taken that posture as an ongoing posture since then, that they would prefer not to proactively engage in the evictions. They only respond if the sheriff is already on site and requesting their backup, which has been really helpful because the police being proactive would really be a pain in the butt. So all of that is to say those are some of the ways that we've started to think about and approach the community piece of community organizing, which is I know a scary word to a lot of folks. You think of folks just knocking the door and asking for 25 bucks. We don't ask for money when we go to folks' doors, but really it's really about thinking about how do we get people to decide to take the first step to get into this bigger fight, and to build struggle from our strengths, saying if numbers is part of our strength, how do we engage those folks, and how do we allow people some space to radicalize through the struggle rather than expecting people to already have decided to be radical from the beginning. And so thinking about things like, as we plan stuff, how do we engage a whole neighborhood? What does it have to look like? Well, I mean, one of our move-ins, we went out and we talked to neighbors. There were lots of kids in the neighborhood, and there were a lot of people who had a lot of fear in the neighborhood. And so we said, great, we're going to start in the park. We're going to march from the park. We're going to have balloons. We're going to hand out balloons to the kids along the road. It's going to be so much fun. We're going to have drums. And we moved the family back in, and everyone came and had snacks and cocoa. I don't know, what are they doing down there? They're moving their family in. It's great. So thinking about that kind of stuff, right? Like sometimes it's easy to get caught up in one aesthetic or another, but actually trying to get a sense of the neighborhood and saying what sorts of things will resonate and excite people here, and maybe have people do something really exciting, but dressed up as something that feels accessible. Also thinking a lot about how we respect the space in the neighborhood. So people can only handle so much intense, crazy stuff happening so often, right? And in some cases, we had a lot of conflict around one house for a while, and lots of people. Like for a while, there was a couple hundred people camped out on the lawn for a day or two. That gets intense for the whole neighborhood, and so we afterwards handmade really silly, sort of flowery cards that were like, "Thank you for being a part of our struggle. It's so awesome that you're like this awesome." And went to people's doors and said, you know, like, we know it's been super intense. Like, we just want to be honest about that. If you're concerned about it, like, talk to us. But hey, you rock for just like being awesome and being there and being supportive. And just sort of, you know, some people said, yeah, that was intense, I'm not super excited about it. But said, yeah, but I still support you anyway, it's okay. So one of the other things we've really struggled with over the last 2 years is there's this awesome energy, right? There was awesome energy of people coming out of Occupy. There was awesome energy and resistance around a whole lot of things. But there's these cycles of that energy where it's like, it's great, and then everyone burns out. It's great, and everything burns out. And that wasn't going to work for us to sustain the kind of fights. Like, part of the dynamics of the opposition around these homes is that they try to wait you out, right? It's like an endurance battle. They want to see if you can go for the marathon, because if all you can do is sprint, they're going to outlast you. They're going to wait that one day more and then come for you. And so trying to figure out how do we create enough different ways for people to be engaged, to have enough support, broad enough support, different ways to get engaged in the fight, but also ways to get really involved and step out a little bit, but not just give up entirely. So you could be a rapid responder and just go when the cell phone call comes, or you could get really involved and be a part of a team of folks around a house, or you could be stepping in and out of those different roles without having to burn out entirely and just give up. And that may or may not be really successful entirely. I think there's still a lot of burnout. And it may just be the coffee talking. I'm feeling excited, but but I think, you know, it's a constant struggle of how do we build sustainable ability to be engaged in something that's very long term. And that's true for the folks that we've been working with, that it's their home that's in the point of conflict. That folks sometimes have needed just permission from everybody else to just relax for a little bit. And it almost comes as a surprise when everyone acknowledges it's okay to take a break. We had one family that was really, really traumatized by the way that they were evicted. Again, they were evicted really early in the morning. The police shut down 4 blocks around their house. And they were the one house where they were actually raided like on a drug raid. People with guns went through both the side door, the front door, and the back door. There was only one person in the house at the time. The woman is a cancer survivor and was still in her pajamas. Her husband had taken their 10-year-old daughter to school, and the police had waited till she was inside the school building and stopped him and held him as well outside of his vehicle so he couldn't go home to aid his wife. When our rapid response dispatcher got the call, all we heard on the other end was her scream, "The police are in the house," and then the phone was grabbed out of her hand and the police like chucked the phone out. And so that family just traumatized, right? They'd never been through anything that intense. She had a gun pointed at her head. She was forced out on the street in her pajamas. She wasn't allowed to pack her things. And you know, he was also traumatized by it. He felt like he was trying to get back to her and couldn't aid her. And they just needed, after all of that, some safe space and a moment to not have to be in the middle of a conflict. And so we started talking with them about, okay, so what could you do that helps you feel like you're still a part of the support and the movement building, but doesn't require you to move back in. Like they said, we can't do it. We can't move back in and try to retake our house because it's just too intense for us right now. And so they started doing a lot of support media work for other folks and telling their story and getting their story out in every avenue that they could, and going and confronting the public officials that had been a part of their eviction, and doing another kind of support work that they could handle at that point, but not trying to take on more than they could do, not trying to push beyond where they actually had an emotional threshold. So the other thing that I think has been a strength surface through this work has been that there's lots of different kinds of relationships, and that the more we've worked to maintain and build and grow those relationships, the stronger and better and more creative and exciting and flexible the work has become to defend homes, and the more options are out there. The more we've been able to start exploring how do we not just talk about foreclosure. In fact, we're moving pretty far from just talking about foreclosure and into this idea of how do we actually have a community discussion about housing justice. And that incorporates how do we deal with the issue of precarious housing situations, how do we talk about it being bank tenants rather than homeowners, how do we talk about the affinity between bank tenants and houseless community and squatters and folks who are in all kinds of various precariousness of housing. And how do we build that dialogue in the same way as coming into neighborhoods and from neighborhoods and starting having neighborhoods organized around filling empty homes, which everybody hates, by the way. You all know it, I'm sure. But if you go out and talk to working class neighborhoods, people hate the empty homes in their house or near their house. They hate that the homes are empty for any number of reasons, but it's traumatic actually. Like, people feel a loss when there's just homes sitting empty on their streets, and they would rather have people fill them. But they have lots of fear generated around it, right? The press and the police do a wonderful job of having everybody fear who might be living in that empty house next door, right? We spent a lot of time trying to help combat the really negative way that squatters were being framed in the media, because it felt like if they could go after and bash squatters, that they could go after and bash anybody else in the housing movement, that was going to be used as a weapon. They were going to start with squatting, they were going to start with trying to bust squats, but it was going to affect everybody, and we had to actually figure out how to combat that narrative and say, no, we want people to move in next door, because otherwise the houses are empty. Otherwise, there's rats living there. Otherwise, the houses fall apart. And so we started looking at how do we have that dialogue as a whole community and push back against this idea that trespass is the most important thing that the police should be enforcing. Push back against this idea that people who move into empty homes are scary, and talk about the people moving into empty homes as a piece of taking back our community.